Okay, so picture this. You're in your workshop, sun's coming in through those dusty windows, and right there in front of you is your trusty Ferguson tractor.
Mm-hmm.
It's time for some maintenance. But where do you even start?
Right.
Well, that's where we come in. Our deep dive today is going to take us into the legendary Ferguson manual.
Oh, yeah.
This thing is like a Bible for keeping these machines running.
Absolutely.
So we're going to pull out the real gems from this manual and hopefully help you become a real tractor whisperer.
It's a cool journey. The manual doesn't just tell you how to do something.
Yeah.
It tells you why it's done that way and, what to look out for.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about, turning wrenches. It's about understanding why you're doing it.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with something that I think every Ferguson owner's going to face at some point, engine removal.
Right.
Now, the manual's got, step-by-step instructions.
Yeah.
But is there anything in there that you think might trip someone up?
I'd say it's easy to get caught up in the nuts and bolts of taking the engine out, and you overlook a crucial detail. The engine oil.
The oil. What's so special about the oil when you're taking the engine out?
Well, think of the oil like the engine's diary. It's recording everything that's happening inside.
Okay.
So the manual really stresses inspecting the oil for signs of trouble, like during the removal process.
Okay.
Metal flakes, discoloration.
So you're not just draining the oil, you're looking at it.
Exactly. You're playing detective.
Okay.
And if you find anything suspicious, save a sample.
Okay.
It could be a clue to diagnose a bigger problem.
That's a really good tip.
Yeah.
Honestly, I usually just treat oil changes like routine, not an investigation.
Mm.
So once we got the engine out, where does the manual take us next?
Right to the heart of it, the valves.
Okay.
These guys are essential, but the manual goes deep.
So it's more than just making sure they're working.
Oh, yeah. It breaks down every part.
Okay.
It even has diagrams showing markings like EX for exhaust valves
Okay.
and specific part numbers.
So it's not just knowing that they open and close.
Yeah.
It's knowing the details.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets interesting. Certain models have these things called rotocaps on the exhaust valves.
Okay.
They're like these tiny turbines that spin the valve as the engine runs.
Why would they do that? It sounds complicated.
It's brilliant. The spinning spreads the wear and heat evenly, meaning your valves last longer,
Okay.
and the engine runs better.
Okay, color me impressed. So I'm starting to see why this manual is so legendary. What else is there about valve maintenance?
Well, here's a surprise. The manual actually tells you not to use sandpaper on the valves.
Really? Why not?
Because even though sandpaper seems like a way to smooth things out, it can leave scratches
Okay.
that mess with the performance.
So it's all about being gentle with these parts.
Exactly.
Okay, so no shortcuts. What about checking for wear and tear? How does the manual handle that?
It gives you the whole process, even down to measuring the valve stems and margins with special tools.
Wow.
It even explains valve grinding.
What is that?
It's like giving the valve a facial to smooth it out.
So it's like the manual's holding your hand the whole way.
Yeah.
So we've covered removing the engine and giving our valves some TLC. What's next?
Next, we dive into valve guides and seats.
Go for
They're
it.
the unsung heroes that keep everything sealed tight and running smoothly.
And knowing this manual, I bet there's more to it than meets the eye.
Oh, yeah. For starters, it insists on using special Ferguson tools.
So not just any wrench will do.
Right. It's got to be the right one.
Okay, so what else is in there that I might not expect?
Well, did you know that the valve seat actually has to be narrower than the valve face?
I did not know that.
Why is that?
Apparently it's all about preventing carbon buildup
Okay.
and making sure the heat transfers properly.
So even simple components have their own little set of rules.
Absolutely.
It's like a secret language, and we're learning how to speak it.
Exactly. And speaking of crucial components, valve springs.
Okay, those are the things that keep the valves closed.
Yeah, like the unsung heroes of the engine. Constantly working.
And you know what? The manual is very particular about how you check and install them.
Okay.
It mentions checking the squareness,
The squareness. What does that even mean?
basically making sure they are perfectly aligned.
Why is it so important?
Even a little misalignment can throw off the whole system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, lead to bad performance or even engine damage.
I am definitely getting the attention to detail vibe from this manual. Where does it take us next?
Well, if the valves are the heart, the rocker arm assembly is like the nervous system.
Okay, so we're going into the nervous system.
Yeah.
What does it say about that?
It guides you through the whole thing, taking it apart, inspecting each piece, putting it all back together in the right order.
Okay.
Even points out markings on the parts, like 7R and 8L.
Okay, so it's like a puzzle but with labels.
Exactly. And remember that feeler gauge we talked about with the valves?
Yeah.
That comes in handier, too, for adjusting the valve clearance within the rocker arm assembly. The manual gives you all the measurements.
I'm guessing there's no room for error here.
Nope. It's got to be just right.
Okay, and that attention to detail continues as we go down to the cylinder block and sleeves. So now we're getting into the real core of the engine.
Right. And the manual wants to make sure that core is solid.
Okay.
It talks about checking the cylinder block for warpage.
Warpage. So like any bending.
Exactly. Like making sure the house is built on level ground.
Gotcha. What about the cylinder sleeves themselves? Anything surprising there?
Well, it really stresses using matched piston and sleeve pairs.
Okay.
It's not one size fits all.
Right. I imagine getting that wrong could cause some problems.
For sure. And of course, it walks you through the whole installation process.
Sit back by step.
Everything from cleaning and lubrication to a good seal.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got the block and sleeves. What about the pistons themselves?
Well, the pistons are like the athletes of the engine, always pushing and pulling.
Okay.
The manual has a whole section on inspecting them for wear and tear, particularly measuring the piston skirt diameter to make sure it hasn't collapsed.
A lot of measuring going on here.
Yeah, these engines are tough, but they need a little care.
Okay.
And here's a cool thing. The manual links piston wear to cylinder sleeve wear.
So if one's showing signs of age, the other probably is too.
Exactly. It's like they're best friends.
Okay.
The manual even talks about different types of piston rings for the engine.
It's like it's got a parts catalog built right in.
Yeah.
Okay, we've covered a lot in the engine. Where to next?
To the backbone, the crankshaft.
Crankshaft. It's like the spine,
Right.
transferring all the power.
Right. And the manual describes its construction in detail, including that awesome lubrication system. It also really stresses checking for wear and tear, especially on the bearing journals.
So no wobbly spines allowed.
Definitely not. And it tells you how to measure something called crankshaft end play
Great.
and adjust it with shims.
Sounds precise.
It is, but the manual breaks it down.
I'm starting to think I could rebuild a Ferguson engine.
Maybe.
What's next?
No engine is complete without its bearings.
Bearings. What are those, like the ball bearings in a skateboard?
Kind of, but way more important.
Okay.
And the manual makes sure you get the right oil clearance.
So not too tight, not too loose.
Right? It's got to be just right.
What are some of the tricks for figuring that out?
Well, it actually gives you a couple of different methods. One uses this stuff called plastigauge.
Okay.
It's a special material that squishes under pressure to show the clearance.
That sounds fancy.
It is, but if you don't have that, the manual also explains how to use a regular feeler gauge to get it done.
So it's about having options.
Yeah, finding what works for you.
Okay. So we've covered bearings.
Yeah.
What else is there?
Next is the camshaft. It's like the conductor of the engine orchestra.
Okay. I like that analogy. What does the manual say about it?
It takes you through inspection, detailing specific measurements for the camshaft journals. It also talks about checking the distributor drive gear for any damage.
So making sure the conductor's baton is in good shape.
Exactly.
Mhm.
And here's the manual being meticulous again. It includes a drawing and instructions on how to check the camshaft end play using a dial indicator.
Wow. So specific.
Yeah.
I'm guessing accuracy is really important here.
Absolutely. It even says you need to install the tappets before putting the camshaft in.
Oh, wow. So many little details.
It's like it's reminding you to slow down and pay attention.
Okay. So camshaft is covered. What's next?
Well, next are the timing gears.
The gears that keep everything in sync.
Yep. The manual tells you how they work and then shows you how to check them for wear. It even shows you how to measure something called backlash using a dial indicator.
Backlash. What's that?
It's the play between the gears too much and the timing's off too little, and they bind up.
So it's finding the right balance again.
Exactly. And it also shows you how to make sure the gears are meshing properly using punch marks on the gears.
They really thought of everything.
They did. And speaking of keeping things smooth, let's move to the governor assembly.
The governor, that's what keeps the engine from running away, right?
Yeah, like the cruise control. It keeps the RPM steady.
Okay.
The manual explains how it works, all the connections between the governor, linkage, the throttle, the carburetor butterfly.
It sounds kind of complicated.
It is, but the manual breaks it down. It even gives you instructions on how to adjust the governor to get that nice, smooth throttle control.
Okay. So we know how to keep it from revving too high. What about getting the power to the wheels? What's next?
The flywheel and the clutch.
Okay, the flywheel, that's the big heavy disc that smooths out the engine's power.
Right, it's super important. And the manual helps you check it to make sure it's not cracked, warped, or worn out. It even has instructions on replacing the ring gear, which is what the starter uses.
So it's not just a big chunk of metal. There's a lot to it.
Yeah. And then there's the clutch. It's like the gatekeeper between the engine and the transmission.
Right. The clutch is what lets us shift gears and stop smoothly.
Exactly. The manual talks about the different types of clutches in Fergusons, like the Rockford and the long clutch.
Okay.
And it even has pictures to help you tell them apart.
So it's like a clutch identification guide.
Yeah. And then it covers adjusting it. It says to use a new disc assembly when you're setting it up.
Yep.
Oh, and here's an interesting thing. It mentions that some models with a cushioned disc actually got a new clutch pedal design.
Why'd they change the pedal?
Probably to make it feel better.
Okay.
But the point is, the manual keeps you updated on all the changes.
Yeah, so you know what to expect.
Right. And then it gets into taking apart and checking both the Rockford and long clutches. It shows you all the parts and what to look for.
Wow, that's pretty detailed.
It is. It even has instructions for servicing the clutch facing. Riveting new facings onto the disc.
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah, and it tells you everything you need to know about the clutch springs, the different colors, the pressures, how they're arranged.
Wow, it's like a custom clutch tuning guide.
It is. So we've covered the power side. What's next?
What else is there?
Well, no engine can run without its lifeblood, the lubrication system.
Right, that's what keeps everything moving smoothly.
Exactly. And the manual makes it clear how important this is. It describes the whole full-pressure lubrication system in detail. It even has diagrams to show you how the oil flows through everything. And it points out differences between the TO-30 and older models.
So even similar models can have their quirks.
Yeah, you gotta know what you're working with.
Definitely. And I bet the manual talks about the oil pump, too.
Oh, yeah. It walks you through taking it apart and checking it for wear and tear.
Okay.
It even tells you how to check the oil pump gear backlash.
It sounds pretty technical.
It is, but the manual explains it.
Okay, so what about the oil filter?
It talks about the different types used on different models, explains what they do and how to use the right one for your engine. It even warns you about switching filters even if they look the same.
So no mixing and matching.
Nope, gotta use the right one.
Makes sense. Okay, we've covered the oil. What's next?
Next is the cooling system.
Right, gotta keep things cool.
Exactly. The manual explains the whole pressure-type cooling system in detail. It even has a diagram to show how the coolant flows through everything.
Okay.
It also tells you all about the thermostat and how it regulates the flow.
So that's what keeps the engine at the right temperature.
Yeah, and the manual says don't even think about running it without a thermostat or with the wrong one.
I can imagine that would be bad.
It would. And it also tells you how to flush the cooling system. Get all the gunk out of there.
Okay, so it's like spring cleaning for the engine.
Exactly. Gotta keep it clean.
All right, so the oil is flowing, the engine is cool. What's next?
Now we gotta get the fuel and air to the engine.
The fuel and air. That's what makes it go boom, right?
Yeah. The manual describes all the parts of those systems, like the fuel tank, the fuel filter, and the air cleaner. It even has a diagram to show you how they all fit together.
So it's like a map of the engine's breathing.
Yeah, and it tells you how to maintain those systems. It says to use varnish solvent when you're cleaning the fuel filter and air cleaner.
Varnish solvent. Sounds intense.
It is. It gets rid of all that stubborn gunk.
Okay.
And here's another little tip. It recommends a specific type of oil for the air cleaner oil cup.
Why is that so important?
Apparently, using the wrong kind can mess up how well the air cleaner works.
Wow, so many details.
Yeah, and speaking of details, let's talk about the carburetor.
Okay, the carburetor. That's where the fuel and air get mixed together, right?
Exactly. And the manual goes deep. It explains how both the idle fuel system and the main fuel system work. It even describes the Venturi principle and how it applies to the carburetor.
It's like a physics lesson and a shop class all in one.
Yeah. And of course, it also tells you how to take care of the carburetor. Take it apart, clean, put it back together.
So it's more than just putting it back together. It's making sure it's clean.
Yeah, I got to get it squeaky clean. And it tells you how to adjust the float level and the idle air, which can really affect how the engine runs.
Okay.
And it even has pictures to help you get it right.
So we've got the fuel and air mix perfect. What's next?
Let's talk about the electrical system.
The electrical system. That's what makes the spark, right?
Yeah, and the manual covers everything. Starting with the starter motor, it tells you how to inspect it and fix it, how to check the brushes, and service the Bendix drive.
So it's making sure the engine can actually start.
Exactly. And it also explains how the starter switch works, how it all connects together.
So it's not just about replacing parts. It's about knowing how they work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the generator. It keeps the battery charged while the engine is running.
Right, because a dead battery is no fun.
Yeah. The manual talks about the different types of generators used in Ferguson's, like Delco Remy and Lucas, and it tells you how to inspect them and fix them. Things like checking the brushes, cleaning the commutator, and all the other parts.
So it's a full tune-up for the generator.
Yeah, and then there's the voltage regulator. It makes sure the generator doesn't overcharge the battery.
So it's like a safety feature.
Exactly. It protects everything. The manual explains the different types of regulators and how to install them correctly.
Okay, so we've covered starting and charging. What's next?
The ignition
The
system.
ignition system. That's what provides the spark.
Right. And the manual gives you detailed instructions on how to inspect and adjust the ignition coil and the distributor. It talks about checking the point gap and the spring tension, and it even has pictures to guide you.
So it's all about getting a good, strong spark.
Exactly. And then it talks about setting the engine timing. It tells you how to use a timing light and gives you the specific settings for different engine speeds and models.
Wow, it's really specific.
It is. And finally, there are the spark plugs.
The spark plugs, those are the things that actually make the spark happen.
Yep, and they take a lot of abuse. The manual tells you how to take them out, clean them, adjust them, and put them back in. It even talks about setting the gap correctly.
So there's a right way to do it.
There is. And that attention to detail is what makes this manual so great.
Well, we've covered a lot in the engine. Is there more to this manual, or have we reached the end?
Oh, we've just scratched the surface. There's a whole lot more to explore.
Okay, well, I am ready for more, but maybe we should take a break and come back fresh.
Sounds good.
We'll pick up where we left off and see what other treasures this manual holds.
Absolutely.
Okay, I am ready to get back into this Ferguson manual. I feel like we just scratched the surface of this thing.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We spent a lot of time in the engine, but there's a whole lot more to a tractor than just the engine.
Right. It's like we explored the heart, but now we got to figure out how to make the rest of the body move.
Exactly. So let's shift gears both literally and figuratively and talk about the powertrain and the brakes.
Okay, so from the engine to the wheels and everything in between.
Yeah, all the parts that put that engine power to work and bring the whole thing to a stop.
All right, so we're talking transmission, differential axles, all that good stuff.
Yeah, and the manual does not disappoint. It gives you the complete rundown on how to take apart, inspect, and put back together every single part.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah.
So where do we start?
Let's start with the transmission. That's the gearbox that lets you pick different gears and control the speed.
Okay, the transmission, the heart of the powertrain.
Right. And the manual starts by telling you how to safely remove it from the tractor.
Okay, safety first, always a good reminder.
Absolutely. It talks about supporting it properly and using a jack or hoist so you don't hurt yourself.
Makes sense. So once we got the transmission out, what's in there?
It's like a whole world of gears, shafts, bearings, and seals, all working together to get that power to the wheels.
Yeah, sounds complicated.
It is, but the manual breaks it down step by step. It tells you what each part does and how to check for wear and tear.
So it's like a guided tour of the transmission.
Yeah, and it even covers things like the PTO support assembly. That's what runs all those attachments you hook up to the tractor.
Okay, so it's not just about moving the tractor, it's about powering all the tools too.
Exactly. And speaking of important parts, the manual also tells you how to check and replace bearings in the transmission. It says to use special tools to make sure they're seated right.
Okay, so the right tool for the job.
Absolutely. And here's something else. It explains all about the oil seals in the transmission. They keep the oil where it's supposed to be.
Right, because oil leaks are bad news.
Definitely. The manual shows you how to install new seals the right way, so they last a long time.
No shortcuts. Nope. Gotta do it right. And once you've checked everything and fixed what needs fixing, the manual helps you put it all back together.
It sounds like a pretty involved process.
It is, but the manual makes it clear. So you know what goes where and how it all fits together.
Okay, so we've conquered the transmission. What's next?
Let's move on to the differential. That's what lets the rear wheels turn at different speeds when you're going around a corner.
The differential. That's clever engineering.
It is. It keeps your tires from skidding and scrubbing when you turn. The manual explains how it works, and then it shows you how to take it apart, inspect it, and put it back together. It talks about checking the gears and bearings for wear, making sure everything's got enough oil, and adjusting the backlash.
Backlash again? I thought that was just for timing gears.
Nope, backlash is important. Anytime you've got gears meshing together, it's all about finding the right amount of play.
Okay, starting to see how all this fits together. So what's after the differential?
Next, we've got the rear axles. They're what actually connect the differential to the wheels. Okay, so those are the things that deliver the power to the ground.
Exactly. The manual tells you how to take them off and take them apart. It's really big on safety and making sure you don't damage the oil seals.
Safety first, got it.
It then shows you how to inspect and replace the bearing seals and other parts inside the axles. Make sure everything's ready to handle all that weight.
So it's like a full checkup for the rear end.
Yeah, and here's the manual being super detailed again. It even tells you how to adjust the axle shaft end play using shims.
Axle shaft end play. What's that?
It's how much the axle shafts can move back and forth. Too much play and things wear out faster, so the manual shows you how to get it just right.
It seems like every little detail matters.
It does. And speaking of important details, let's talk about the brakes.
The brakes. Yeah, can't forget about those.
Definitely. The manual gives you a complete overview of how the Ferguson's braking system works. It explains how it's self-energizing.
Self-energizing, what does that mean?
It means the design helps to multiply the force you apply with the pedal, so you get more stopping power.
That's smart. So it's like the brakes are giving you a boost.
Exactly. And it also explains how the dual pedals work, so you can brake each rear wheel separately or both together.
So it's like having two sets of brakes.
Yeah, and of course, the manual shows you how to take the brakes apart, inspect them, and put them back together. It tells you what to look for in terms of wear and how to adjust them for the best stopping power.
So it's all about making sure the brakes are in tip-top shape.
Absolutely. It even talks about the brake linkage and how to make sure it's properly lubricated and moving freely.
So it's not just the brakes themselves,
Yeah,
it's the whole system.
right. Got to make sure everything's working together.
Okay, so we've covered the powertrain and the brakes. Those are some pretty important systems.
They are, and we're not done yet. There's still more to explore in this amazing manual.
All right, bring it on. What's next?
Now we're going to dive into something that's truly special about Ferguson tractors, the hydraulic system.
The hydraulic system.
Mm.
That's what powers the three-point hitch,
Mm-hmm.
right? The thing that made these tractors so revolutionary.
You got it. And the manual has a whole section dedicated to it. It starts with the hydraulic pump, which is the heart of the system.
So the pump is what creates the pressure to lift and lower the implement.
Exactly. And the manual walks you through everything you need to know about servicing the pump, taking it apart, inspecting it, putting it back together.
So what are some of the things you look for when you're inspecting the pump?
Well, you want to check the gears, the shaft, and the seals for wear. It even tells you how to check the clearances inside the pump using a feeler gauge.
Wow, it's getting pretty detailed.
It is, but it's all about making sure the pump is in good shape. Then the manual moves on to the hydraulic control valve.
Okay, the control valve, that's what directs the fluid to the different parts of the system.
Right. It's like the brain of the hydraulics. The manual explains how it works, the different positions, and how they control the implements.
So it's not just about turning the valve on and off.
Yeah.
It's about knowing how to use it to make the implements do what you want.
Yeah. Exactly. And of course, it also tells you how to service the valve, how to take it apart, check for wear, and put it back together with new gaskets so it doesn't leak.
So it's the same process as with the other systems.
Yeah.
Take it apart, inspect it, put it back together.
Yeah, but every system has its own quirks, and the manual makes sure you know what to look for.
Okay, so we've got the pump and the valve. What about the part that actually does the lifting?
That would be the hydraulic ram cylinder, the muscle of the three-point hitch.
Ah, the ram cylinder, the workhorse.
Yeah, and the manual tells you how to check it for wear and tear. It even tells you how to measure the inside diameter and check the seals. It also has instructions on replacing the hydraulic piston rings.
Okay, so those are the things that keep the fluid from leaking past the piston.
Right, got to keep everything sealed up tight. And then the manual moves on to the hydraulic lift shaft and its bushings.
The lift shaft, that's what connects the ram cylinder to the hitch arms.
Yep, and the bushings help it move smoothly. The manual shows you how to check them and replace them. It's really big on using the right tools and making sure everything's aligned properly.
I'm sensing a theme here. This manual really wants you to use the right tools for the job.
It does. It's all about doing things the right way so they last. And speaking of doing things right, it also talks about the control mechanisms for the hydraulics.
So that's the levers and knobs that you use to control the hitch.
Exactly. It starts with the control quadrant. That's where the lift lever and other controls are. The manual tells you how to take it apart, inspect it, and put it back together. It even talks about the friction disc that helps make the lift lever move smoothly.
So it's all about making the controls feel good and work, right?
Yeah, and it also talks about the hydraulic lift cover plate. It's an important part that helps keep everything aligned and working properly.
Okay, so it's not just the moving parts. It's the stuff that holds it all together, too.
Right, everything has its role. And once you've gone through the whole hydraulic system, the manual helps you put it all back together. It makes sure you install everything correctly and that there are no leaks.
It's like putting together a giant puzzle.
It is, but this manual is your guide. It even reminds you to use the right hydraulic fluid and to adjust the controls to get the lift just how you want it.
Wow. So much attention to detail.
Yeah, that's what makes this manual so great. It's not just about fixing things, it's about understanding how everything works and how to make it work even better.
Okay. I feel like I could rebuild a Ferguson's hydraulics now.
Mm.
What's next?
Let's move on to the front end of the tractor.
Okay, the front end, that's what steers the whole thing.
It is, and it's also important for stability and ride comfort. The manual starts with the front axle itself. It's what holds the front wheels and lets them turn.
So it's like the foundation of the front end.
Yeah, and the manual tells you how to inspect and replace the pivot pin and bushings. That's what lets the axle turn smoothly.
Makes sense. So those parts are worn out. The steering will feel stiff.
Exactly. And the manual even mentions that the pivot pin can sometimes make a squeaking noise.
A squeak that doesn't sound too serious.
It's not usually. It just means it needs some lubrication. But it's good to know that the manual even covers those little things.
Yeah, it's like it's trying to anticipate any problems you might run into.
Exactly. So after the front axle, it moves on to the front wheel hubs.
Okay, the hubs,
Ah.
those hold the bearings for the wheels.
Right. And the manual shows you how to take them apart clean and repack the bearings and adjust them so the wheels spin freely.
It's like a tune-up for the front wheels.
Yeah. And then it talks about the front wheel spindles. They're what connect the hubs to the axle.
So those are important for keeping the wheels attached and aligned.
Exactly. The manual shows you how to check them for wear and how to replace them if needed. Then it moves on to the radius rods.
Radius rods, I don't think I've heard of those.
They connect the front axle to the frame. They help keep the axle aligned and they absorb shocks.
So they're kind of like the suspension for the front end.
Yeah, and the manual shows you how to inspect and adjust them. It's really important to make sure the ball joints on the back of the rods are in good shape and have enough lubrication.
Okay, so it's all about making sure the front axle can move freely.
Right, it needs to be able to go up and down without binding.
Yeah.
So after the radius rods, the manual moves on to the steering gear.
The steering gear, the thing that actually makes the wheels turn.
Exactly. And it explains how the whole thing works, all the gears and shafts and bearings. It shows you how to take it off the tractor safely and then how to take it apart and inspect everything.
So it's like a deep dive into the steering system.
It is, and it's really detailed. It shows you how to check and replace all the different parts, the steering sectors, the steering arms, the bushings. It even tells you how to service the steering shaft bearings.
Wow, that's a lot of information.
It is, but it's all important if you want to keep your tractor steering properly. And once you put it all back together, the manual tells you how to adjust the steering gear.
Adjust it.
It shows you how to get the gears meshing just right so the steering feels smooth and responsive.
So it's all about fine-tuning the steering.
Exactly. And the last thing it tells you to do is fill the steering gear housing with the right oil.
Okay, so lubrication is important for the steering too.
Yeah, got to keep everything moving smoothly.
Wow. I'm learning so much about how all these systems work. It's amazing how much detail is packed into this manual.
It is. It's truly a comprehensive guide to the Ferguson tractor.
And speaking of comprehensive, the manual also has a really helpful index so you can find information quickly.
It does, and it also has spaces for you to write down important service information and keep track of repairs.
So it's like a personalized maintenance log for your tractor.
Exactly. It's a great way to keep track of everything you've done.
I love that. So we've covered the powertrain, the brakes, the hydraulics, and the front end. What's next on our journey through this amazing manual?
Well, we've covered the major systems, but there's still a lot more detail to explore. The manual has specific information about all sorts of components and systems. It gives you specifications, clearances, torque values, and all sorts of other useful stuff.
Wow, it seems like this manual has everything.
It pretty much does. It's like having a direct line to the engineers who design these tractors.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into those details. Where do we start?
Let's go back to the engine and focus on the cylinder head.
Okay, back to the heart of the machine.
Yep. The manual talks about inspecting the valves for wear and damage, making sure they're sealing properly and that they're within the acceptable tolerances. It also talks about replacing the valve guides if they're worn out, and it even gives you the maximum allowable size for the valve guide bushings.
So it's all about preventing leaks and making sure everything fits snugly.
Right. And then it talks about installing valve seat inserts.
Valve seat inserts.
Yeah.
What are those?
There's special hardened rings that you press into the cylinder head. They give the valves a good sealing surface. The manual tells you how to install them properly using the right tools and making sure they're the right size. It even says that the valve seat has to be narrower than the valve face.
Okay, so there's a specific way to do it.
There is. It's all about getting the details right. And after the valve seats, it talks about the cylinder sleeves.
Okay, the cylinder sleeves, those are what the pistons slide against, right?
Exactly. And the manual is very specific about using matched piston and sleeve pairs. You can't just use any old piston with any old sleeve. They have to be matched.
Wow, that's interesting. Why is that?
It's all about maintaining the correct clearances for optimal performance.
Okay, that makes sense. What else does it say about the sleeves?
It gives you the maximum allowable out-of-roundness and taper for the sleeves. They have to be perfectly cylindrical.
So it's not just about the size, it's about the shape.
Exactly. And then it gets into piston rings.
The piston rings, those are the things that seal the gap between the piston and the cylinder wall.
Yep. And the manual tells you exactly how much clearance they should have in their grooves. Too much or too little, and you'll have problems.
So it's like finding the sweet spot for the rings.
Exactly. Then it talks about the crankshaft and how much end play it should have.
Crankshaft end play. What's that?
It's how much the crankshaft can move back and forth along its axis. The manual tells you how to measure it and how to adjust it if it's too much.
So it's another one of those fine-tuning adjustments.
It is. And then it talks about the bearings, both the main bearings and the connecting rod bearings. It gives you specific oil clearance ranges for each one.
So you're making sure the bearings have enough oil to do their job.
Right. And the manual shows you how to measure that clearance using either plastic gauge or feeler gauges.
Wow. So much precision.
Yeah, and then it gets into the timing gears. It tells you how much backlash they should have.
Backlash, again, seems like that's important for a lot of things.
It is. It's all about making sure the gears mesh properly. The manual even shows you how to measure the backlash using a dial indicator.
Okay, so we're getting really technical now.
We are, but the manual makes it clear. And then it talks about the governor assembly. It gives you specific RPM values for different engine speeds and pulley speeds. It also shows you how to adjust the governor linkage.
So you can fine-tune how the engine responds?
Exactly. Then it talks about the clutch and the clutch springs. It gives you the specs for the springs. So, they're providing the right clamping force.
So it's all about making sure the clutch engages smoothly.
Right. And then it talks about lubrication. It tells you exactly what type of oil to use for the engine, the transmission, and the hydraulics. It gives you the viscosity and the filling quantities.
So you know you're putting the right fluids in the right places.
Exactly. And then it talks about torque values.
Torque values, I'm not sure what those are.
It's how tight you need to tighten bolts and nuts. The manual gives you specific torque values for all sorts of fasteners on the tractor.
Wow, so you don't over-tighten or under-tighten anything?
Right. You got to get it just right.
Yeah.
And finally, the manual talks a lot about the importance of regular maintenance.
Yeah, that's key for keeping any machine running well.
Absolutely. It's all about being proactive and catching problems early.
So it's like preventive medicine for your tractor.
Exactly.
Well, I have to say, I'm impressed with how thorough this manual is. It seems like it covers absolutely everything.
It does. It's an incredible resource for anyone who owns a Ferguson tractor.
Yeah, and it's more than just a repair guide. It's like a philosophy of how to take care of these machines.
I agree. It's all about understanding how they work and taking pride in keeping them running smoothly.
And speaking of keeping them running, what's next on our adventure through the Ferguson manual?
Believe it or not, there's still more to explore. The manual goes into even more detail about specific parts and procedures. It's like a treasure trove of knowledge waiting to be discovered.
All right, I'm ready to dig in. Let's see what other gems we can uncover. Man, I'm still thinking about all that stuff in that manual. It's amazing how much there is to know about these tractors.
I know, right? It's packed with information, and it's written so well, too. It's like you're talking to the people who actually designed it.
Yeah, it's not just a list of steps. It's like they want you to really understand how everything works.
It's about empowering you to take care of your tractor.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And not just fix it when it breaks, but like prevent problems from happening in the first place.
It's all about respect for the machine.
I like that. So Harry Ferguson's vision was about more than just building tractors.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
He wanted to give people the knowledge to be self-sufficient.
Right. Give them the tools to do things themselves.
It's pretty inspiring that anyone with the right information can learn to work on these tractors.
Yeah, it shows you what's possible.
And it's not just about tractors, right? It's about taking on any challenge.
Absolutely. It's about solving problems and figuring things out.
This whole deep dive into the Ferguson manual has been a real learning experience for me.
Me too.
It's made me appreciate these tractors even more.
Yeah, they're amazing machines.
And if anyone out there is thinking about getting a Ferguson or already has one, get yourself a copy of this manual.
Oh, yeah.
It's the best way to learn about these tractors.
Absolutely.
But even with all this information in the manual,
Yeah.
you got to be patient when you're working on these things.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Things don't always go as planned.
Right. Sometimes you got to take a step back and figure things out.
And don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it.
Yeah, there's no shame in that.
Nope, we all learn from each other.
Well, I think we can all agree that the Ferguson Manual is more than just a book.
Definitely.
It's a guide to a whole way of thinking.
A way of working.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a real pleasure.
Likewise.
And to everyone listening, keep those tractors running and never stop learning.